Nathanael Chalmers, the blue-coat boy who pushed the boundaries, not always successfully, but nonetheless was a great southern adventurer. When we think of pioneering life in places like Otago, we sometimes forget the enormous sense of adventure that could be involved. Numerous families from Scotland sent younger sons out to Otago to make their fortunes, for example, with varying degrees of success. One example is Nathanael Chalmers, who was born here at Rothesay on the Isle of Bute in 1830. He was the son of a doctor from Aberdeen who'd spent years working in Malaya for the East India Company, during which he'd married the daughter of the Dutch governor of Malacca. Nathanael's family was thus fairly distinguished on both sides, and you have to say he came from a fairly privileged sort of background. But he was also the youngest of 7 sons in a family of 12. Colonial adventures were always on the cards for boys like him seeking to get ahead. The Chalmers didn't stay long in Rothesay. When Nathanael was still just a boy, they moved to Croydon near London, and he was educated at Christ's Hospital, a famous old endowed school whose pupils were known as bluecoats after their distinctive uniforms. He left at 15 and worked for a year at a shipbroker's office in Liverpool, and then joined the Royal Bank of Australia as a clerk in its London office. But Nathanael's father had meanwhile become a member of the Free Church Lay Association's committee in London, and in 1848 he bought 2 of its land packages in Otago, one for Nathanael and one for his older brother Alexander. The 2 boys, aged about 19 and 22 respectively, took ship for Otago on the Ajax, the 6th Otago Association ship sent out to the new colony Otago in September 1848. The Chalmers boys travelled intermediate class in a cabin and were accompanied by servants, the Hay family, in steerage. They also brought with them all the equipment they might need to establish farms on the land their father had bought for them. Now this was in South Otago, well to the south of the Dunedin settlement, and when the 2 boys made themselves known to the colony's leader, Captain William Cargill, he advised them to hold off on occupying these rural lands for the present. Better by far, he reckoned, to stick close to Dunedin and develop the suburban lands that were also part of their packages, and thereby implement the key principles he'd espoused for the new settlement, which were concentration and contiguity. Now, naturally, with the wisdom of youth, the headstrong Chalmers brothers ignored this sage advice and immediately struck out for South Otago. Alex went overland while Nathanael bought a whaleboat, hired a Māori crew and set sail down the coast. The servants and all the gear came separately in another Māori boat. Now, it proved quite an adventure, but eventually everyone and all the gear were safely landed. Now began the hard graft of carving farms out of the virgin landscape. Quite a challenge for middle-class lads who'd never milked a cow, used a hoe, or swung an axe in their lives. They seem to have kept their sense of humour nonetheless, naming 2 conical hills near their respective properties concentration and contiguity in a sort of mockery of Captain Cargill's settlement policy. What a difference it must have been from their former lives in London, but they seem to have relished the challenges, working hard to establish their properties far from any other settlers. Their taste for adventure endured. In 1852, news of gold strikes in Victoria saw them cross the Tasman to try their luck, though with little success. Alex, however, ended up settling there in Melbourne and took on a banking career. Nathanael, however, returned to New Zealand, helping take the first shipment of sheep to Southland. He then took part in a great cattle droving expedition across the Southland Plains with Māori guides. Back at his farm in Romahapa, but intrigued by Māori stories of the interior, Chalmers sold up his property and engaged chiefs Riko and Kaikoura to lead him inland.
5 days after leaving Mataura and climbing to a high point between Nevis and Nokomai, Chalmers saw in the distance a great lake, identified for him by Reko as Wakatipu. He was the first European to ever see it. Moving further on the mountains, he was also the first European to follow the old Māori trail, crossing the Kawerau by the natural stone bridge that used to exist there. But by the time they reached the flatland, where Cromwell is now, Chalmers was in a bad way, suffering from chronic diarrhea and with his clothing and his footwear torn to shreds. It was time to head back to the coast, and the old chiefs had a way of getting there fast. They whipped up a mokahi out of bundles of flax stalks, made some paddles out of driftwood, and with the ailing Chalmers in the middle of their new raft, they pushed off into the fast-flowing Mata'o, the Clutha. What a ride it was! Chalmers effectively becoming the first Otago tourist to go whitewater rafting. He later recalled how his heart was literally in his mouth here at the gap, while Reko and Kaikoura calmly paddled on through the turbulent waters of the gorge and onto the calmer waters beyond, safely home to South Otago.
Nathanael now switched his attention to sheep farming at Popotunoa. He'd done plenty of time roughing it as a bachelor, and there are some infamous descriptions of him, his wild appearance and primitive living conditions in other settlers' accounts. But in 1856, he got married. His bride was Ellen McGrath, a Catholic from the Channel Islands who was working as a governess on a neighbour's property.
Nathanael and Ellen would have spent another dozen years on various southern runs and time here in Invercargill, where he became the Deputy Superintendent and the very first Treasurer of the province of Southland. He was also closely connected with the establishment of a railway in Southland from Invercargill to Makarewa, but unfortunately he sanctioned its use of wooden railway lines that doomed it to ignominious failure.
That wasn't his only colonial failure. In 1864, he joined two older brothers on a run at Moa Flat, but they lost the property to a mortgagee a couple of years later and thereafter scattered around the world, all leaving Otago for good. Nathanael and Ellen, by now with 5 children, headed to Fiji, where he took up cotton growing and then ran a sugar plantation. He did pretty well at that and also became a magistrate. But relations between Nathanael and Ellen had gradually frayed over his increasing antipathy to her Catholic faith. In the end, she could stand it no more and left him, moving to live with a daughter in Sydney.
Nathanael missed her terribly, and eventually he travelled to Sydney to try and win her back. But it was too late. Ellen died while he was still on his way, and he spent his final years in Suva alone and irascible, where he died in 1910, aged 80. It was perhaps a rather sad end for one of southern New Zealand's great pioneer adventurers.